Heather Dennich, I hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to Tuscaloosa.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, yesterday your name was brought up a lot by the callers, and when we have questions, we try to reach out with those who have followed this, and I don't think anybody has followed it as close as we've went into this college football playoff era and how we get these four teams. When you look at the Tua Tagovailoa injury, can you walk us through the understanding? Let's just say Tua is not ready to go against LSU. Is there a calculation of an injury when it's your star quarterback, and how do they consider that when they're trying to evaluate the best four teams?
Absolutely. And if you remember last year when Clemson's starting quarterback Trevor Lawrence was injured in the game against Syracuse, Chase Bryce had to come in and win that game for them. That's one of those things that the selection committee takes note of. And it can work out two ways. I mean, Alabama can win the game and not look that great. Maybe he's shaky in it. And the selection committee realizes that and notes that. They can lose the game maybe if they don't have him, and maybe that's a hall pass for Alabama. And the selection committee's mentality when viewing injuries is wait and see. They've got to see what they look like with maybe a partially healthy Tua or maybe his backup quarterback. And if you remember Ohio State in 2014, it was the same thing with Cardale Jones. Nobody, not even Ohio State, knew what to expect from him going into that Big Ten championship game at Wisconsin. And neither did the selection committee, so they've got to see what that team looks like with whoever is at quarterback.
You know, Heather, when you look at this year, and I've mentioned this with several times throughout the audience, this next 40 days is going to be crazy because in the years past, we've always sort of had Alabama and Clemson separating themselves. I think we have a lot of teams to be determined, and that's going to set up for an awesome month of the last month of college football season.
There's no question. I feel like it's so much more interesting this year because people aren't even talking about Oregon, and they're still in it. We don't really know, in my opinion, how good Penn State is. I mean, Michigan was a good win, but I think that in order to really assert themselves in the college football playoff race, Penn State needs to beat Ohio. Wisconsin could beat Ohio State on the road this year. There are just so many other teams. People are forgetting about Notre Dame, which also has to go to Michigan this week. So it is not just Alabama and Clemson. And if Clemson loses to South Carolina, we've all seen what kind of fit South Carolina has given teams in each of the past 2 weeks, then that really opens the door for debate.
Well, you've written about it today on ESPN.com. Notre Dame, Auburn, Wisconsin face must-win road games. And if you think about Auburn, I mean, you look at Auburn, think about their resume that's not right now. Yeah, they've got the loss against Florida, but they go to LSU, you get Georgia, you get Alabama, you beat those teams, you could be right there in the conversation.
Yes, and we saw that in 2017 with Auburn. I mean, you want to and naturally eliminate a two-loss team, and it would seem likely, and it makes sense that if they lose at LSU, their chances drop drastically, right? But they also have two top 10 opponents remaining in Georgia and Alabama. My question, and which is different from the 2017 scenario, is where does the selection committee have Georgia ranked in that first ranking because of that loss to South Carolina? Georgia's interesting because they have a really good non-conference win against Notre Dame, but how much does that South Carolina loss sting them? Because one of the reasons Auburn was still considered as a two-loss team going into that SEC championship game was because it had defeated the committee's two number one teams. Alabama and Georgia both were number one at separate times that year. So it'll be interesting to see what Auburn can do and how the committee handles their strength of schedule down the stretch, because there's no question it's tough.
With an LSU win over Auburn, do you feel like that first rankings will include LSU at number one or Ohio State or maybe even possibly Alabama or Clemson? If you're looking at it, you know this as well as anybody that studies this college football playoff and the way they go in and evaluate that. Who do you feel will be that number one team if LSU gets the win against Auburn?
I think it would be LSU. I would be really surprised if it wasn't. I think LSU has earned the number one spot right now. If the selection committee walked out of there on Tuesday, it would really surprise me if they didn't have them number one, because don't forget they have the road win at Texas. I mean, that alone you could argue is better than anything Clemson or Alabama has done, because what does a win against Texas A&M mean right now? That's another one of those things. Fans have to watch how the opponents are ranked in that first ranking and continue to follow that, because that affects the contender's strength of schedule.
When you look at Clemson, is there any chance, and I was listening to you and Trevor and Brad debate this on Saturday on ESPN radio, is there any chance you could see a Clemson undefeated getting left out? I mean, is there any scenario that you can come up with in your head if they run the table and still get left out of the college football playoffs?
I'm trying. I mean, the only scenario is to have undefeated Oklahoma, undefeated Alabama, undefeated Ohio State. No, I don't see any scenario because the Pac-12 already has one loss. I mean, Notre Dame already has one loss as well. To me, the only way that would even be a question is if there were if everybody else was undefeated, and it's not going to happen. It can't happen.
When are we expanding beyond 4 teams?
Well, it's interesting. This summer I asked Bill Hancock how long it took to go from the BCS to this, and he said about 3 years. So let's say if they decided tomorrow they wanted to expand to 8, which isn't happening, you can kind of ballpark at least 3 years to get the next thing, whatever it is, figured out. I would be surprised if it happened anytime within the next 6 years. But I do think it's inevitable. I just don't think it's coming any time in the near future.
Well, but this year could add a catalyst for that, right? I mean, you got some teams that feel like that they belong there and they get left out, and the argument gets louder and louder and louder. And, I guess it'd be a great way to push some of these conference commissioners maybe in that direction if their team got left out.
They could. Yeah, I mean, I think that the noise was, you could say, at an all-time high last season. I mean, there's still a chance that the SEC can get 2 teams in. There's still a chance that, albeit slight, that the Big Ten can get 2 teams in. So there are still a lot of scenarios that could play out that could certainly drive that discussion in the postseason.
Yeah, walk us through maybe some scenarios that you think could get 2 teams in. I mean, we've already discussed the injury factor with Tua, but other than that, is there other ways that you could see, like at LSU, maybe they come to Bryant-Denny and lose by 3 points somehow, some way, and maybe this is just a hard-fought game that you really don't feel like that you could drop them out of that. What are scenarios that you could see 2 SEC teams in?
Well, I mean, this is a long shot, and I certainly wouldn't predict it to happen. But what if Georgia does run the table and beat Alabama to win the SEC, and Alabama's only losses to Georgia? I mean, then what do you do?
Sure.
But I think the most likely scenario is the LSU-Alabama debate in the SEC West, because if the loser of that game, and we haven't gotten there yet, I realize that, has only one loss, then they win the SEC, right? I'm saying the loser of that game doesn't make it to the SEC championship game. That's their only loss, and they wind up losing to the SEC champ. Then, in my mind, that's the most realistic scenario for them to get 2 teams in. And then in the Big Ten, Penn State and Ohio State still have to play each other. And we have Wisconsin and Ohio State on Saturday. They could still see each other again in the Big Ten championship game. It all depends on what happens in all of those other Power 5 conferences. Is there a window for it to happen for the selection committee to really consider a second team from the same conference, or do you have an undefeated Clemson and an undefeated, Ohio State and 2 teams from the SEC? And it depends on what everybody else does to create that domino effect. Oh,
this is going to be a lot of fun. As you're sitting there going through that, I feel like you're offering a trailer for a movie that's going to be coming up in a month. I mean, it's just like, I'm going and, the anxiety begins to build because it's the unknown that's going to be so much great about this final month of college football. Where do you see Alabama? Where would you have Alabama if you were in that room and you were voting on them? What do you see in this football team here in Tuscaloosa?
Well, I think they're certainly a top 4 team. I think that's obvious, but I dropped them down this past weekend in my top 4 for ESPN.com. I think I had them at number 3. Only reason was because of the uncertainty with Tua at that point. We didn't know. But, I mean, if you look at what they've done, they're in the top 10 in offensive and defensive efficiency. And when their quarterback is healthy, those wide receivers are absolutely unbelievable. And I know people keep calling their defense into question, but they're still 7th in the country in defensive efficiency. I think we need to see them progress down the stretch and have those kinds of statement wins against LSU and Auburn, because the one thing that you can do with Alabama right now is question its strength of schedule a little bit. But I think road wins against South Carolina and Texas A&M as long as both of those teams finish over 500, will be considered respectable wins by the selection committee.
Heather, final question. We're talking to Heather Dennich from ESPN. Where do you have Tua Tagovailoa in the Heisman race right now? And I know we still have a month. It's still a very quality month left. Where do you have him in the Heisman race right now?
Yeah, I had him in the top 5. I really struggled with it, turning it into ESPN.com past week. Even Jonathan Taylor, the running back at Wisconsin, fumbled the ball against Illinois. So my editor was asking who I have. I said, can I just put Joe Burrow, Joe Burrow, Joe Burrow, Joe Burrow?
Sure.
He was like, no. So, I think I had Tua in there behind. I had Burrow, Fields. Who else am I missing? I don't have it.
Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, Hurts. I think I had Burrow, Hurts, Fields, Tua, and then Jonathan Taylor was the way I had it this past one. No Trevor Lawrence after the 2 picks.
But with the opportunity with Tua Tagovailoa going up against LSU, the SEC championship game, still time to make up the ground there in yours and a lot of other Heisman voters throughout the country. Heather, thank you again for joining us here in Tuscaloosa. We kind of lean on your expertise. Nobody's followed as close as you have. And when we have questions about this college football playoff committee, we appreciate we could pick your brain here for 12 or 13 minutes. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.